January 17th, 2022, 8:32 p.m. Emily Carter, 27, is seen on surveillance footage walking alone toward her apartment building in downtown Columbus, Ohio. The video is clear, too clear. She adjusts the strap of her bag, checks her phone, and pauses briefly under a flickering streetlight. Nothing about her behavior suggests fear. Nothing suggests she knows what's about to happen. Investigators would later say this footage captured her final known moments. And for months, everyone focused on Emily, her movements, her timeline, her last messages, the people she spoke to. Every frame was dissected over and over again in search of answers. But no one noticed what was happening just behind her. Not the police, not the media, not even the thousands of people who watched the footage online. Because what mattered most wasn't Emily. It was something in the background, something subtle, something almost impossible to see, until you know exactly where to look. And once you see it, the entire case changes. January 17th, 2022, 8:32 p.m. Emily Carter, 27, is seen on surveillance footage walking alone toward her apartment building in downtown Columbus, Ohio. The video is clear, too clear. She adjusts the strap of her bag, checks her phone, and pauses briefly under a flickering streetlight. Nothing about her behavior suggests fear. Nothing suggests she knows what's about to happen. Investigators would later say this footage captured her final known moments. And for months, everyone focused on Emily, her movements, her timeline, her last messages, the people she spoke to. Every frame was dissected over and over again in search of answers. But no one noticed what was happening just behind her. Not the police, not the media, not even the thousands of people who watched the footage online. Because what mattered most wasn't Emily. It was something in the background, something subtle, something almost impossible to see, until you know exactly where to look. And once you see it, the entire case changes. But to understand why that detail matters, you have to understand Emily. Because Emily Carter was not the kind of person who disappeared without a trace. She was structured, predictable in the best way. The kind of person who texted when she got home, who shared her location with two close friends, who locked her doors even during the day. Friends described her as calm, deliberate, and quietly observant. She didn't take unnecessary risks. She didn't stay out late without telling someone. She didn't trust easily. But once she did, she was loyal. She worked as a junior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm just a few blocks from her apartment. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable. And she liked stability. Every weekday followed a rhythm. She woke up at 6:45 a.m., made coffee, and listened to the same morning news podcast while getting ready. By 8:10, she was out the door. By 8:25, she was at her desk. Lunch was almost always at the same cafe. A turkey sandwich, no mayo, black coffee. After work, she either went straight home or stopped at the gym 2 blocks away. Her keycard logs would later confirm just how consistent she was. Same times, same days, no deviations. Routine can be comforting, but in cases like this, routine can also create blind spots. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because on January 17th, Emily's routine did change. Not dramatically, not in a way that raised immediate concern, but enough that later, investigators would circle back to it again and again. That morning started the same as any other. Her phone connected to her apartment Wi-Fi at 6:43 a.m. Her coffee machine, a smart model, registered its usual activation at 6:51. Her fitness tracker logged a short stretch session at 7:02. Nothing unusual. At 8:12, she left for work. Security cameras in her building captured her exiting through the front door, wearing a dark coat and carrying her laptop bag. She arrived at work on time. Colleagues would later say she seemed normal, focused, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. She attended her morning meeting, responded to emails, and completed a quarterly report she had been working on for days. At 12:18 p.m., she placed her usual lunch order. At 1:02 p.m., she returned to her desk. Everything aligned with her routine so precisely that, at first, there was nothing to question. But sometime after 4:30 p.m., something changed. No one could say exactly what. There was no dramatic phone call, no visible distress, no argument, just a subtle shift in behavior that, at the time, meant nothing. She left work slightly later than usual. 6:07 p.m., 17 minutes past her normal departure. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone. People worked late all the time. But for Emily, 17 minutes was a deviation. And deviations matter. What they didn't notice was that Emily didn't go straight home. Her phone location data showed her walking in the opposite direction for nearly 10 minutes, toward a quieter part of downtown. Fewer businesses, less foot traffic, a place she had no recorded history of visiting. But this is where the questions begin, because there was no clear reason for her to be there. No purchase records, no known contacts in that area, no messages arranging a meeting. It was as if she had decided spontaneously to go somewhere unfamiliar, and that wasn't like her. At 6:21 p.m., her phone pinged near a small parking lot behind a closed retail building. She remained there for approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes with no calls, no texts, no transactions. Then, at 6:27, she began walking again, back toward the main street, back toward the direction of her apartment. By 6:41, she entered a grocery store she visited occasionally. Surveillance inside shows her moving through the aisles with purpose. She picks up a bottle of water, a pre-packaged salad, and a small container of fruit. Nothing unusual, except for one thing. She checks her phone repeatedly, more than usual. Not texting, not calling, just looking, as if waiting for something or someone. But this is where everything changes. Because when investigators first reviewed this footage, they focused on Emily's behavior, her pacing, her expressions, her repeated glances at her phone. They asked what she was waiting for. What they didn't ask was who else might have been watching her. At 7:03 p.m., she leaves the store. Her receipt timestamp confirms the time. Her card transaction matches it exactly. From there, it's a straight 12-minute walk to her apartment, a route she had taken hundreds of times. Well-lit streets, active intersections, familiar surroundings, safe. At least, it appeared that way. At 7:18 p.m., a traffic camera captures her crossing an intersection 3 blocks from home. She's alone, or at least it looks that way. And this is the part no one questioned, because Emily did everything right. She stayed in populated areas. She kept her routine. She avoided unnecessary risks. Even her slight deviation earlier in the evening didn't immediately signal danger. But routines don't protect you from what you don't see. And by the time she reaches that final stretch of sidewalk, the one captured at 8:32 p.m., something has already gone wrong. Something subtle, something quiet, something no one noticed at the time. Because everyone was still focused on Emily, and not on what had already entered the frame behind her. By the time investigators begin reconstructing the timeline, the assumption feels almost unavoidable. Emily Carter walked home alone. That belief shapes everything that follows. From 7:18 p.m., when she's last seen clearly at the intersection 3 blocks from her apartment, there is a gap. No continuous footage. No direct line of sight. Just scattered cameras, partial angles, and fragments of movement stitched together into a narrative that feels complete. But it isn't. At 7:24 p.m., a parking garage camera captures a figure matching Emily's description passing along the edge of the frame. The resolution is lower, the lighting harsher. Her face is not fully visible, but her clothing, her height, her gait all align. She's still alone. At least, that's how it appears. At 7:31 p.m., another camera picks her up near a bus stop. She slows slightly, adjusts her bag again, and briefly looks over her shoulder. That moment is noted. Investigators replay it several times. Was she nervous? Did she hear something? Or was it nothing more than a reflex, the kind of movement people make without thinking? In the end, it's dismissed, because there is no one visible behind her. And this is where the narrative locks in. At 7:46 p.m., her phone records its final active screen unlock. No message is sent. No call is made. Just a brief interaction, lasting 4 seconds. Then, nothing. At 8:02 p.m., her device stops transmitting location data. No shutdown alert. No battery warning. It simply goes dark. And from that point forward, the investigation becomes urgent. At 9:10 p.m., Emily's friend, Lauren Mitchell, sends a message asking if she got home safely. Emily always replied, always. By 9:28 p.m., another message is sent. No response. At 10:14 p.m., Lauren tries calling. It goes straight to voicemail. That's when concern turns into action. By 11:02 p.m., a missing persons report is filed. Officers begin canvassing the area early the next morning. They retrace her route. They collect surveillance footage. They speak to store employees, nearby residents, anyone who might have seen something. And eventually, they find it. The camera, mounted above a convenience store, angled slightly downward, capturing a narrow stretch of sidewalk just half a block from Emily's apartment. Timestamped January 17th, 2022, 8:32 p.m. The footage is clear. Emily enters from the left side of the frame. She's walking at a steady pace, her bag over her shoulder, her phone in her hand. She pauses briefly under the streetlight, adjusts the strap, looks down at her screen. Exactly as described, exactly as expected. This becomes the defining image of the case, the last confirmed sighting. And for weeks, it is analyzed frame by frame. Investigators focus on her body language, her posture, her pace. They look for signs of distress, hesitation, awareness of danger. They find none. She appears calm, unaware, alone. But this is where everything begins to narrow. Because once that assumption takes hold, it shapes the direction of the entire investigation. Detectives begin looking inward. They examine her personal life, her relationships, her coworkers, her friends, her past, anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. Within days, attention centers on one name, Daniel Reeves, a former coworker who had left the company 2 months earlier. There had been tension, not documented officially, but mentioned casually by colleagues. Daniel had shown interest in Emily. Repeatedly, she had declined, politely but firmly. After he left the company, there were a few messages. Nothing overtly threatening, but persistent enough to raise concern in hindsight. And that's all it takes. Because once investigators believe Emily was alone in that footage, the threat must have come from someone who knew her, someone who could anticipate her routine, someone who didn't need to be seen. Daniel becomes the focus. His phone records place him in the general area that evening. Not unusual. He lived downtown, but close enough to matter. He is brought in for questioning. He denies everything. Says he hasn't spoken to Emily in weeks. says he was out that night, walking, clearing his head. There are no direct witnesses placing him with her. No forensic evidence tying him to her disappearance. But there is pressure, public pressure, media attention. A young woman vanishes steps from her home. There has to be an answer. And Daniel fits. By March, he is arrested, charged based on circumstantial evidence and behavioral patterns that, to investigators, suggest escalation. The case moves quickly. Too quickly, some would later argue. At trial, the prosecution builds a narrative around obsession, rejection, opportunity. They present the surveillance footage. They show Emily walking alone. They emphasize the absence of anyone else. The defense argues lack of evidence. No DNA. No eyewitnesses. No clear motive beyond speculation. But the image is powerful. A woman alone at night. A man who had shown interest. A timeline that, while incomplete, feels convincing. And in October 2022, Daniel Reeves is convicted. The case is closed. Officially. But something doesn't sit right. Not with everyone. Some investigators, even within the department, feel the conclusion came too easily. Too clean. Because cases like this rarely are. And then there's the footage. That same clip. 8:32 p.m. Watched hundreds of times. Analyzed, slowed, enhanced. Everyone looking at Emily. Trying to understand her final moments. Trying to see what she saw. But no one asks a different question. What if the most important detail wasn't in front of her at all? What if it was behind her? Because the truth is, the footage never changed. The answer was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop focusing on Emily and start looking at everything else. The case should have ended there. A conviction, a closed file, a narrative that, on the surface, made sense. But for one person, it didn't. Maya Singh was not part of the original investigation. She wasn't a detective on the case, and she wasn't involved in the trial. She was a digital forensic analyst brought in nearly a year later as part of an internal audit reviewing closed cases with limited physical evidence. At first, Emily Carter's case looked complete. Too complete. That was the first thing Maya noticed. Because most real cases leave behind loose ends, gaps, unanswered questions that never fully resolve. But this one felt sealed, and that made her uneasy. So she went back to the beginning. Not the reports, not the interviews, the footage. She watched the 8:32 p.m. clip the same way everyone else had. Focused on Emily, her steps, her posture, her expression. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested she was in immediate danger. But Maya wasn't looking for behavior. She was looking for inconsistencies. And this is where everything changes. On her third pass, she muted the audio, dimmed the lights in her office, and slowed the footage down to half speed. Then a quarter. Then frame by frame. Not watching Emily. Watching everything else. The edges of the screen. The shadows. The parts most people ignore. And that's when she saw it. At first, it didn't look like anything. A faint movement in the background. Top right corner of the frame. Barely visible. Easy to dismiss as a lighting glitch or compression artifact. But it moved. Not randomly. Deliberately. Maya paused the footage. Rewound it. Played it again. There it was. A figure. Partially obscured by darkness, positioned behind a parked vehicle just beyond the reach of the streetlight, standing still, facing the sidewalk, facing Emily. And this is the detail everyone missed, because the human eye is drawn to motion in the center of a frame, to the subject, to Emily. No one had reason to scan the corners. No one expected the threat to already be there, waiting. But the more Maya analyzed it, the clearer it became. The figure wasn't passing by, wasn't coincidental. They were already in position before Emily entered the frame, which meant one thing: this wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Maya enhanced the footage using updated software that hadn't been available during the initial investigation. Contrast adjustments, light amplification, frame reconstruction. Slowly, the outline sharpened. A hooded jacket, a distinct posture, and most importantly, movement that aligned with something investigators had overlooked entirely. At 8:32 and 11 seconds p.m., just as Emily pauses under the streetlight, the figure shifts weight slightly. At 8 hours, 32 minutes, and 14 seconds, they step forward, still partially hidden, still outside the main focus of the frame. At 8 hours, 32 minutes, and 18 seconds, Emily begins walking again, and the figure follows, maintaining distance, staying just behind the edge of visibility. For 6 seconds, they move in sync. Then both exit the frame, Emily toward her apartment, the figure into darkness. And this is where everything unravels. Because Daniel Reeves could not have been that person. Phone records, re-examined with precise timestamp alignment, placed him nearly half a mile away at that exact moment. The margin of error was too small, the timeline too tight. He had been investigated under the assumption that Emily was alone, but she wasn't. The case had been built on a false premise. Maya's findings triggered a quiet internal review. At first, there was resistance. Reopening a closed case meant admitting a mistake. But the footage didn't lie. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Within weeks, Daniel Reeves' conviction was overturned. He was released after 11 months in custody. But that was only the beginning, because now investigators had to start over. This time with the right question: who was already waiting for Emily? The answer came from something small. Something that had been collected, but never prioritized. A vehicle, parked near the edge of the frame, previously dismissed as irrelevant. Maya cross-referenced traffic camera data, parking records, and nearby business surveillance. The car appeared in multiple locations across several nights leading up to January 17th. Always near Emily's route, always at a distance, watching. The license plate, partially obscured in earlier footage, was finally enhanced enough to generate a match. It led to a name that had never come up in the original investigation: Thomas Avery, a maintenance contractor who had worked intermittently in buildings across downtown, including Emily's. Not someone she knew personally, but someone who had seen her, someone who had observed her routine, quietly, repeatedly. When questioned, his initial statements were vague, inconsistent, and under scrutiny, they began to collapse. Digital evidence placed his phone near Emily's apartment on multiple nights, including January 17th. Further analysis revealed searches related to her workplace, her schedule, even the grocery store she visited. He had been studying her, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment. And on that night, he positioned himself exactly where the footage shows, just outside the light, just outside attention. The rest of the case unfolded methodically. Evidence that had once seemed unrelated now aligned. A timeline reconstructed without assumptions. A narrative built on what was actually there, not what people thought they saw. Thomas Avery was arrested in May 2023. And this time, the evidence held. Not because it was louder, but because it was clearer. Because someone finally looked at the part of the story no one else had. Emily Carter's case became a quiet turning point. Not just because justice was corrected, but because it exposed something deeper. A pattern in how people see and how they miss. Because everyone was watching Emily, trying to understand her final moments, trying to find meaning in her actions. But the truth was never in front of her. It was behind her, in the shadows, In the corner of a frame, no one thought to question. And that is the part that changes everything. Because sometimes the most important detail isn't hidden. It's simply ignored. So the next time you see a story like this, look again. Not at what they tell you to watch, but at everything else. Because the answer might already be there, waiting.